Michael spent time with me at Prince Charles. He showed leadership then, and it's not surprised to see him at this position today. Very appreciative, Michael. I show these two slides because there's a learning curve that we all have to go through. And the gentleman over there, it was the laser work, is Lord Brock, and that's Mark O'Brien, who's one of my mentors when I migrated to Australia. And Mark would say to me, when he worked with Brock, congenital cyanotic disease was a massive problem in cardiac surgery. These infants and young children died. And they tried all these operations to salvage them, and learning how to do shunts, and eventually bypass, the cardiopulmonary bypass appeared and things got better. But Brock would scrub with him one day and say to him, O'Brien, I wonder how many I'm going to kill today. Because ordinarily, on a day that they operated, 2 out of the 3 children died. And that must have been a massive burden to go through, but they persevered to get surgery at a level where it is now. Of course, cardiac surgery has a broad spectrum, and I had to sort of pick out something to show a bit of an evolution of what's happened and try and lock into that evidence-based. But that's the spectrum we really have. And of course, there is this slide, which I love, the technology curve, because technologies come along, and they're either the early adapters that see this is beneficial, they learn about it, the market sees, oh, this is beneficial for us as well, so they get involved, and the market takes it on, the market becomes mature. And then a new technology arrives, and those that think this is beneficial would again be on that curve to learn. But eventually, those that stand back and say, why are you doing this? And if you get a bad outcome, they go, see, I told you shouldn't be doing it. They go, well, this is actually, everybody's doing it now, I better start doing it as well. So that's what I experienced in a few of the technologies we took on. If this plays, I just want to, you've probably seen some of this, and I'm not going to harp through it, but robotics, as you know, has become important. So the surgeon is in a console out of theatre, but this is a grape, and it's amazing what you see. You see 3 arms, and the new ports will have a single arm with these 3 manipulated arms that can come out and do this for you. So we've acquired one in the private institute. When we looked at costing, however, we found the minimally invasive program we already had was more beneficial, because I can't go to a patient and say, hey, you've got to give me $2,000 or $3,000 so I can pay for the consumables, but I can do you the same operation through a slightly bigger incision and then charge you nothing. So we didn't adopt it, but certainly other programs have taken it on with very good results. But you can see it's quite amazing what you can see using the system. And those are the procedures you can do. I beg your pardon. It's not that important for this presentation, and that's why this instrument is so amazing. You have these endo wrists that you can put in any position you want, put them into small holes, and the colorectal surgeons love this device because they can get deep in the pelvis and manipulate things around and do amazing stuff with it. But of course, there's a cost factor. The industry and the market is something that's amazing. I got involved in this project in 2004. It was called the Holygraft. So this is a synthetic graft with connectors that go through coronaries with a flow limit to the cava, because you create this huge shunt. What I learned is never ever trust the market and the shareholders involved in markets. I never regarded myself as a highly intelligent man, but I looked at this and thought this can't work. But I got involved in a lot of experimental work in pigs, and when we did the human trials, it failed. Many of my colleagues internationally said, no, it would work, and I was like, really? And at the end, I had to conclude, maybe I'm not that stupid. But I was conned, and that's another story. This is something I feel passionate about, because coronary surgery is still the mainstay of treatment of ischemic heart disease. And of course, there are a lot of ways it can be done. You can even do hybrid work where you say, look, I'll do this, and you keep the cardiologist happy and he stents a vessel. That's not unreasonable if you can do a lima to LADs, a minimally invasive procedure, and they stent a right, for example. There is nothing wrong with stenting. But there's not a single trial to date, no matter how many trials they've done, there's not a single trial that can show you survival benefit with the stent. Certainly they can make patients symptomatic and take angina away, and in acute infarct situations, invaluable. But as far as longevity goes, or survival benefit does not exist. So to harp on about conduits, so this is the conduit that became and put cardiac surgery on the map lifelong. It's the internal mammary artery graft to the LAD, because this single graft infers long-term longevity and survival. So once we learned that, of course, we realized that veins aren't that good. This is a radial artery graft to a PDA. You can see probably, let's say it's 20 years old, which is probably right. It's a beautiful, smooth conduit. And he has a vein graft, and you can see the vein graft disease that's developed. And this is the real problem with vein grafts and why they really don't have a role to play in certain circumstances anymore. So at 15 years, you can see the patency rate compared to mammaries, and because a vein is not an artery, it's just not designed to do that work. And again, there's this histologies to confirm the above, and this is what really saved cardiac surgery. We realized that this internal mammary artery graft LAD gives you survival, and therefore we still have coronary bypass surgery this day. But then we thought, what about second arterial graft? And there's overwhelming evidence that if second or REMA has the same patency rates as a left-sided system. So we knew that at 20 years we could have two grafts that are perfect because they're arteries. And then we looked at survival. And there is no case to be made. If you get two arteries or three arteries, particularly to your left system, you live longer. You don't get infarcts. At 20 years you're going to be alive, and 15% other patients will be dead if they had vein grafts. But what's the problem? In Europe, less than 10% of surgeons do bilateral internal mammary artery grafts. In the USA, less than 5%. I can't give you a figure for Australia, but it's low. The biggest unit in Australia, which is Prince Charles, hardly does arterial work. I don't understand why. We've got this mountain of evidence, but we don't do the hard yards, learn how to do it, and do this work. And this is just some other data showing you just that the survival benefits at the bottom for two mammaries compared to a single mammary artery graft. Excuse me. Again, this is Australian work, and that's why I want to show it in Melbourne, where they've showed excellent results with using the rear right internal mammary artery, and again, survival benefits. The other thing we found looking back is that if you put an arterial graft on an artery, it prevents further atherosclerosis in that vessel. So we can see, therefore, the different configurations you can use when you place these grafts onto the heart. And this is a patient 12 years down the track, which we did at the Holy Spirit, with a Rima-Lima Y-graft configuration. And he'll have excellent, and still has an excellent long-term result. Veins aren't necessarily all that bad if you have a system you can place on the outside, like this external stent, because it supports the vein. And you can see, if you look at these angiograms, they look beautiful. And that's just an ultrasound of it. So what is the bad thing about coronary surgery? Well, it's the pump. We all know that. You put a patient on the pump, the effects, as I'll show later on with aortic work, is just bad for patients. And you can take that, get rid of that if you use OPCAV work, the non-touch technique, or medical management. And the second thing was vein graft failure. But we knew we have a solution for that, and that's to use arterial grafting. So we have to move on to get on to minimally invasive surgery, because that's become a big interest in practice now, particularly with percutaneous valve therapy happening. And we'll touch on that towards the end. There are different ways you can do this. You can do a little thoracotomy in the side, and you can address the mitral tricuspid valve, do ablations. You can do an RAT for the aortic valve, and you can do hemistenotomy, and you can extend that to aortic work. Some even do mitral work through that incision. The big issue with this is, of course, it's a small incision, but if you do this right, you can see the valve extremely well, I beg your pardon, because it's done endoscopically. With shafted instruments, you just can't see the valve like that through a stenotomy. But don't forget the learning curve. You've got to be prepared to do this. And of course, if you really want to push it further, you can do this sort of incision, but this is really hard work. But nonetheless, you can get minimally invasive work done with excellent results, providing you get the same results, obviously. And there's a demand. Patients read, as we heard early on, operating on 80 and 90-year-olds, they do their own research. They come to you saying, I want this done. And patients no longer want stenotomies. They realize other technologies available, and that has to happen. So not surprisingly, for the mitral valve, based on work done in Italy by Alfieri, we got the mitral clip, which is a good tool, and that's basically what it does. And this is done completely percutaneously via the vein across the septum into the left atrium, and the clip clips the two leaflets together and can get rid of mitral regurgitation. It keeps patients out of hospital, lessens heart failure, but long-term plays no role really in degenerative valve disease. And there are a host of other technologies that are coming abroad to do all these, what we do through incisions, minimally invasively or percutaneously. But most of these really have no large trials to show beneficial patient outcomes. Just to a perspective at Prince Charles, for example, when we looked at 965 isolated aortic valve replacements, this mortality rate is unbelievable. And this is real work. We checked this up ourselves. Mortality rate of under 1% for aortic valve replacement. The only bad thing was this one. That's completely unacceptable. But nonetheless, I think that's an amazing result. And when we looked at octogenarians, again, we were really surprised to see a low mortality rate. And I took this further and published a paper with Mark O'Brien in 2001. We presented in London. We looked at all octogenarians, and we found that our mortality rate was between 2.5% and 3.9%, whereas the rest of the world was talking between 5 and 10%. We couldn't work out why, but somehow we just get good results. The drawback, however, comes in with this thing here, stroke. And that is just one of the problems we have when you use the pump and patients get older. Stroke is probably the most debilitating complication you can have. So we can extend this to older patients. And of course, a lot of reviews are happening. People are looking at the outcomes in 80-year-olds plus. And as we heard, I have patients come to me saying, well, I'm 85, why won't you do me? And we've learned how to communicate. If you sit down and really talk to patients, the first thing I say is you're going to take 6 months to get better. And they go, what do you mean? I said, you're going to take 6 months. Maybe 3, but minimum 6. They see you at 6 weeks, how are you? I'm great. They come back a year later, they say, you were right, it took me 6 months. They just don't get better because it's a major operation, use a heart-lung machine, and they just have issues with nutrition and a lot of other factors, and they certainly take a long time to recover. But once they're there, the outcome certainly is extremely good with being asymptomatic and well. So when you go to the minimally invasive arena, the big problem is you can't cannulate centrally, so it all becomes about peripheral cannulation and techniques to protect the heart, because that is central and most important in operating on the heart as a structure. And all these have problems and complications if you don't know how to do it. So you either learn how to do it properly and learn from somebody, but if you're just going to start off doing it, I'll give it a crack. That's one of the things I heard a few years ago. Bring the instrument, said, I want to give it a crack. When you hear that, you really got to be worried. And this is just examples. This is a hemistenotomy, which you can cannulate centrally, and this is a peripherally cannulated right anterior thoracotomy. You can see well, your vision is not bad, but space is limited. And because of this, new designs have come in. These are well-established valves that we know the durability is about 19 years before they do replacement, placed on a scaffold. And now it's used in this form that you can expand it. The same has happened with other valves. For example, the Percival, based on a valve that durability was well worked out. And what they did was put a nitinol stent on it, and now you can put it in as a self-expanding valve, which saves you time. You just deploy the valve with 3 little sutures, no sutures around you have to tie in, and limits your cross-clamp time so you can get the patient out of theatre. But this became paramount. We needed a team approach, which doesn't really happen. The biggest drawback, I think, in Australia is the 2-tier system. You're private, you're busy, let's talk about a patient, I'm sorry, I'm over there. But team approaches have now become vital, and we have a heart valve team at the Holy Spirit we established 4 years ago, and you'd be astonished how many people attend, because the value for the patient is now so important, and we make a combined decision. And for TAVI, or transpercutaneous aortic valves, it is essential, otherwise you can't get the right decision for the patient. So this is the big future in cardiac surgery, percutaneous valves. Is that my time? How much have I got left? Say again? Okay, thanks. So, and this has taken the world by storm. Patient comes in, they have a valve put in through the femoral artery, they go home the next day, they look amazing. You look at this and go, oh, why would you want an open operation? Because it is really quite amazing what you can offer the patient. Okay, so because that happened, of course, the market jumps on board. And these are all the valves you can use these days if you want to do a TAVI. Some you can use in both positions. You can place many of these valves into a previously placed annuloplasty in the mitral valve or valve replacement if they have degeneration in that position. And these are aortics only. So either balloon expandable, as most of these are, so we'll talk about that briefly, or they balloon implanted, and then they have a stent that expands. Now these are almost always associated with higher pacemaker insertion rates because they keep on expanding and interfere with the AV node, and therefore these patients require pacemakers. But this technology has come a long way. This is the latest valve with a skirt, and paravalvular leak is virtually gone. This one hardly has paravalvular leaks, but they all have their pros and cons, because they have to be placed percutaneously. The designs are amazing, and they're getting smaller and smaller. These were original designs. And as you can see, from 24 French, they're going down to 18 French. They think they'll even get to 7 French. But the key here is this is the valve. Now, don't forget this valve, which when you sew in as a surgeon, you never touch the valve tissue, because if you do, you know that's a focus for degeneration. Now, the same company gives you that valve to sew in by hand, takes it and designs it so you can squish it down, to almost 18 French now, and then deploy it and get the same long-term. Of course you can't get the same long-term result. We knew that, and it's coming to fruition now, as I'll share with you. But the interesting thing about this is where technology is going. And we think that, I beg your pardon, we think that in a couple of years' time, the patient will come in and could have their valve done through the radial artery and go home. I mean, that's amazing. You know, they'll be ambulant because it's not a femoral artery. They can get up, walk around, have a cup of coffee in that hand, and that same afternoon go home. It's almost certainly going to happen. And the amazing technologies with materials that can be used in valves, with nanotechnology and e-nitinol endothelialization. You can see numerous designs are in the market and being processed, but none of these have come to fruition yet. The problem is going to be anticoagulation, but durability probably might be better if these valves actually do make it there. Of course, not all patients are suitable to have their procedures done through the femoral access because of aorta-iliac disease, or they could have issues in the aorta itself with atheroma or angulation, because you have to get the valve all the way up the arch and get it into position across the valve. And then, of course, we can do these through what is called the Trance Epical technique, where we do a little mini thoracotomy. You can see the incision on the right-hand side, and you put a purse ring in the apex. Now, if you don't do this right, patients die. I saw a live case in France, and it was interesting because one surgeon ran out the room, collapsed, had an infarct, had a stent that night because he was so distressed by seeing this patient exsanguinate on the table in a live case. And the next morning, Carpentier ran the meeting, said, "Oh, good and bad news. The patient sadly died. Our Greek colleague stented and he's well." It was quite bad. But it can be stressful to see that. And of course, this is a valve being deployed. It's done through the apex. You can see the sheath is in the heart itself. It's a balloon expandable valve, and it's put in position, and you dilate up, and you rapid pace the patient with this pacing wire, and off you go. The patient is done. You can also do this through hemistenotomy if you wish, if you think it's not safe, or if the patient doesn't have, for example, patent grafts coming off the aorta. And here's an example of a hemi. You can see this is the introducing system through the aorta itself, and the valve being expanded, and again, the rapid pacing happening when the valve is implanted. So there are pitfalls with this, of course, which we've learned over time. Many of these are now avoided quite without any issues. But coronary occlusion, if you don't plan well, that can happen with disastrous consequences. The annulus can rupture, but usually this has been resolved by accurate sizing. Leaflet overhang is very uncommon because the valves are placed better. This is a big problem, but getting better. This is not that common anymore because the teams are better and we're trained. Stroke remains an issue, which we'll talk about, and degeneration, of course, is going to happen. So, of course, with this emerging technology, everybody's looking at outcomes. Everyone wants to know, is this safe, is it not safe? Is that me? No. And I can just run through a few, but paravalvular leak is important because patients do not survive. They do not tolerate AI well. Aortic stenosis patient, if they're on the table for a valve and you dilate that stenosed aortic valve, and you don't get the valve in situ very quickly, and you don't start CPR immediately, it's tolerated extremely poorly, which is quite amazing to see in front of your eyes. So paravalvular leak is just a bad thing, and that does influence outcomes of these patients. But this was the next big shock, which surgeons weren't surprised about. We knew this was going to happen. But this was released at a conference in France last year, at a cardiology conference of intervention, and this was really what surprised them, that 50% degenerated at 8 years. So if we do a normal valve replacement in patients with the same tissue, we're looking at 18 years before the valves might need explant. They degenerate from about 12 years onwards, but at a very, very slow rate. So if this is happening in an 80-year-old, how can you take this and put it in a 50-year-old? But this has happened worldwide, sadly, and those valves won't last 4 or 5 years because in younger patients the degeneration is much higher. So this is certainly something that needs to be addressed and concerns most of us. Of course, this is the other important thing. Surgeons look at a valve that's stenosed, it's full of calcium. We excise it, we wash out, we make sure we get all the calcium out, replace the valve. New technology comes, we take a balloon, expand it, send the patient home, bring the patient back, another balloon, expand it, put a valve in. Surely something has to happen there, and we found it does. There is just like being on pump, a massive embolic storm to the brain, and it does affect patients, their cognitive outcome is affected. This is interesting because they said if we do this prior to the, so what they're saying is if you don't dilate the patient on investigation and you do him at the time with a single balloon dilatation, implant the valve, they have a higher rate of embolizer to the brain. But have they looked at the first valve replaced? I bet they haven't because it has to happen then. So we do know that dilating the valve is really a bad thing, and there's evidence to show that some of these patients are getting early dementia as well. So it's not over. We're still looking at this to see where we go. This is the important Partner 1 trial done in America, because when America woke up, Europe were putting TAVI valves into every single patient. So they thought we better set it up properly. It was a combined effort of surgeons and cardiologists. They showed it was safe in patients that weren't operable. They extended to the second group of patients, the intermediate risk patients. Should they have surgery? Could the patient have surgery or TAVI or either? Showed to be safe, lower gradients, lower bleeding problems, less atrial fibrillation. And this is a study from London, which is quite important, because they showed that, and this is the problem with TAVI patients, they're 80, they can't have an operation. So if they can't have an operation, who should get this technology? And some you put them in and they do extremely well, but in the first year you still have quite a big drop-off in the mortality rate, which is concerning because you don't want to have that happen to a patient. And of course, valve-in-valve technology has come. These are valves that you can implant into a patient, and if they become stenotic, this is an animal model, and this is you can see a prosthesis with a TAVI valve placed through the mind. This is other examples. And here's one live done through the apex. There's the valve. You can see the little rings on the bioprosthesis, and there's a valve and a valve to solve that problem for patients if they can't have an operation. And there's even an app you can download on your phone, which I have. And you can look on your app and work out what valve is in, what size to put in, and solve the problem for your patient. Mitral valve is also there, of course. This is new technology. The results are reasonable. It's done transapically, and there's the outcome. Cardiac surgeons feel a bit threatened, you know. And this is my favorite slide, but most people don't get it. So this is cardiac surgery. But I think, you know, if we stand together, if we take on new technologies and share incomes and share thought processes and get patients good outcomes, I think we can achieve a lot. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank you for this opportunity. I don't know if I've really given you what I could in the time allowed. We do face issues with patients that are old, working out who should be operated on. And to my body, the college, I admire the work we're doing with and being respectful. I can't help but think we saw smoke. We thought we might find a fire, but I think we found a volcano. I thank you for your time.